Frank Lucas picked up the phone at 3:47 a.m. on November 15, 1973. The voice on the other end was panicked, desperate. "Frank, they got Mickey. The Italians grabbed him outside his apartment. They want the money, Frank. All of it." Frank's blood went cold. Mickey Rodriguez was his most trusted lieutenant, the only man besides Frank who knew where the real money was hidden. And now the Mafia had him. Frank hung up the phone and sat on the edge of his bed. His wife Eva stirred beside him. "Baby, what's wrong?" Frank didn't answer. His mind was calculating. The Italians had been pressuring him for months. Ever since his blue magic heroin had taken over 80% of Harlem's drug trade, the five families had been demanding their cut. 20%, they said. The same 20% they'd been taxing Harlem for 50 years. But Frank Lucas wasn't like the other dealers. He didn't pay taxes to the Mafia. He didn't need their permission. He had his own supply line, his own distribution network, his own rules. And that made him dangerous. The Italians had tried negotiation first. Carmine Tremonti from the Lucchese family had invited Frank to dinner, made him an offer. "Frank, you're a smart kid. But you're moving too much product without our blessing. That creates problems. Pay us our percentage, and we'll protect you. Refuse, and well, accidents happen." Frank had smiled, shaken Tremonti's hand, and walked out. He didn't pay a single penny. Then came the threats. Dead rats left in Frank's car. Bullets through his office windows. Messages spray-painted on buildings he owned. Pay up or pay with blood. But Frank Lucas didn't scare easily. He'd learned from Bumpy Johnson that fear was just another tool, and the man who refused to be intimidated held all the power. But kidnapping Mickey, that was different. That was personal. That was a declaration of war. Frank stood up, started getting dressed. Eva watched him. "Where are you going?" Frank put on his black suit, black tie. "I'm going to make a phone call." "A phone call? At 4 in the morning?" Frank looked at his wife. "The kind of phone call that ends wars." Frank drove to his office in Harlem, a small building on 125th Street that looked like nothing special from the outside. But the basement held Frank's real operation, the nerve center of an empire that stretched from Southeast Asia to the streets of New York. Frank walked down to his private office, sat behind his desk, and pulled out a small black book. Inside were phone numbers that no one else in America possessed. Numbers for Thai generals, Chinese smugglers, Corsican chemists, corrupt military officials in Vietnam. Frank's secret network, the source of his power. Frank dialed the first number. Thailand. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered in broken English. "Lucas, why you call? Is middle of day here?" Frank spoke quietly, deliberately. "General, I need a favor. A big favor. There are some Italian businessmen in New York who are causing me problems. I need them to understand that I have friends they don't want to upset." The general laughed. "What kind of understanding?" Frank leaned back in his chair. "The kind that makes them realize they're not the only ones with international connections. Can you make some calls? Let certain people know that Frank Lucas is under your protection." "Cost extra," the general said. Frank smiled. "Money's no object. Make it happen." Frank hung up and dialed the next number. Hong Kong. Then Saigon. Then Marseilles. One by one, Frank activated every contact in his network. By dawn, Frank Lucas had made 17 phone calls to 7 different countries. And every single person he called owed Frank Lucas a favor. Big favors. Frank's strategy was simple but brilliant. The Italian Mafia thought they were the only organized crime syndicate with international reach. They had connections in Sicily, in Naples, in families across Europe. But Frank had something they didn't. Frank had connections to the actual source. The poppy fields in Laos and Thailand. The laboratories in Hong Kong. The military supply chains in Vietnam. Frank didn't just buy heroin from middlemen like the Italians did. Frank was the middleman. And now Frank was about to prove it. At 8 a.m. sharp, Frank made one final call. This time, to Carmine Tremonti's restaurant in Little Italy. Tremonti answered personally. Yeah. Frank's voice was ice cold. Carmine, this is Frank Lucas. We need to talk. Tremonti's voice changed immediately. He knew who Frank was. Everyone in New York knew who Frank was by now. Frank, good to hear from you. I was hoping you'd come to your senses about our arrangement. Frank cut him off. Here's the arrangement, Carmine. You're going to release Mickey Rodriguez in the next 2 hours. You're going to pay him $50,000 for his inconvenience. And you're never going to touch any of my people again. Tremonti laughed. Or what, Frank? You gonna send some Harlem thugs after us? Kid, you're out of your league. Frank's voice didn't change. Still calm, still cold. No, Carmine. I'm not sending anyone from Harlem. But I just got off the phone with some friends of mine. Friends you've never heard of but probably should have. There was silence on the other end. Frank continued. General Vang Pao in Laos. Colonel Chen in Hong Kong. Major Dubois in Marseilles. They all send their regards. The silence stretched longer now. Frank knew those names meant nothing to most people. But to someone in the drug trade, someone who understood the international heroin network, those names were terrifying. They represented the real power behind the global opium trade. And Frank Lucas had just claimed them as allies. Frank wasn't finished. See, Carmine, here's what you don't understand. You think you're connected because you know some families in Sicily. But I'm connected to the source. The farmers who grow the opium. The chemists who process it. The military officers who transport it. When you buy heroin, you're buying it from someone who bought it from someone who bought it from me. Frank let that sink in. Which means, when you threaten me, you're not just threatening some street dealer from Harlem. You're threatening their business partner. And that makes them very unhappy. Tremonti's voice was different now. Cautious. What are you saying, Frank? Frank smiled, though Tremonti couldn't see it. I'm saying that in about 6 hours, you're going to get some very interesting phone calls. From people whose names you don't know but whose power you should respect. And they're going to explain to you why it's in everyone's best interest to leave Frank Lucas alone. Frank hung up. 6 hours later, Carmine Tremonti was sitting in his restaurant when the phone rang. The voice on the other end spoke heavily accented English. Mr. Tremonti? This is Colonel Chen, calling from Hong Kong. I understand you have some business disagreement with Mr. Frank Lucas. Tremonti's hand started shaking. How did someone in Hong Kong know about his problems with Frank Lucas? How did they even know his name? The voice continued. Mr. Lucas is valuable partner to our organization. Very valuable. Any harm to Mr. Lucas, any interference with his business, would be seen as interference with our business. And we do not tolerate interference. The line went dead. 10 minutes later, another call. This time from France. Monsieur Tremonti, this is Major Dubois. I believe you have Frank Lucas prisoner. This is mistake. Frank Lucas is protected. You will release prisoner immediately. Another hang-up. By evening, Tremonti had received calls from Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. All saying the same thing, Frank Lucas was untouchable. All demanding Mickey's immediate release. All making it clear that the consequences for harming Frank would be severe and international. Tremonti called his underboss. Get Rodriguez. Bring him here. Now. When Mickey arrived, bruised but alive, Tremonti personally handed him an envelope containing $50,000 cash. Tell Frank Lucas there's been a misunderstanding. Tell him the families have no business with him. Tell him we respect his independence. Mickey stared at the envelope. What happened? Tremonti looked out the window, suddenly feeling very small. Frank Lucas happened. Your boss has friends we didn't know about. Friends we don't want to upset. That night, Mickey returned to Frank's office and told him everything. Frank listened, nodded, and lit a cigarette. Good. Now they understand. Mickey was amazed. How did you do it, Frank? How did you get people in Asia and Europe to call the mafia for you? Frank smiled. Mickey, that's the difference between being a dealer and being a businessman. A dealer buys product and sells it. A businessman builds relationships. And I've been building relationships for 10 years. Frank opened his safe, pulled out a stack of contracts written in Thai, Chinese, and French. These aren't just suppliers, Mickey. These are partners. They make money when I make money. So when someone threatens me, they're threatening their own profits. The next morning, every major newspaper in New York carried the same headline: Harlem drug boss defeats mafia. Within a week, every criminal organization in New York knew the truth: Frank Lucas had protection they couldn't touch. His heroin empire expanded unopposed, making him $2 million a day. Years later, when federal agents finally arrested Frank Lucas, they found evidence of his international network. Phone records to 15 countries. Bank accounts in Thailand, Hong Kong, Switzerland. Frank Lucas, a man who'd never finished high school, had built a network that made La Cosa Nostra look like a neighborhood street gang. And it all started with one phone call at 3:47 a.m., when Frank Lucas decided that respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you demanded. And backed up with the kind of power that crossed oceans and spoke every language. That phone call didn't just save Mickey Rodriguez. It established Frank Lucas as the untouchable king of American organized crime. A king who ruled not through violence, but through connections. Not through fear, but through respect. Not through tradition, but through innovation. But the story doesn't end there. Because Frank's phone call strategy had consequences that reached far beyond that single night in November 1973. It changed the entire landscape of American organized crime forever. Within 6 months of the Mickey Rodriguez incident, Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, underboss of the Genovese crime family, walked into Frank's Harlem office unannounced. "Mr. Lucas, I come here to talk business. This Colonel Chen you know in Hong Kong called my cousin in Palermo. How the hell did you do it, Frank?" Frank explained his strategy. "Tony, real power comes from being useful. I didn't just buy heroin from the Golden Triangle. I invested in it, helped them expand production, provided intelligence. When you help someone become rich, they don't just sell to you. They protect you." That meeting marked a turning point. For the first time in history, the Italian Mafia was asking an outsider for partnership instead of demanding tribute. Frank's terms were non-negotiable: he would sell them pure heroin at 40% below market price. In return, they would stay out of Harlem entirely and provide favors when needed. Every family agreed. The arrangement made everyone rich. The Italian families got better product at lower prices, higher profits, and happier customers. Frank got massive volume purchases that made his Asian partners even wealthier. Most importantly, Frank got something no criminal in American history had ever possessed: the voluntary respect of every major crime syndicate in the country. Frank's genius wasn't just business partnerships. He'd understood something about global drug trade that no American criminal had grasped. The real power wasn't in selling drugs. It was controlling information flow. Frank pulled out a map of Southeast Asia, marked with pins and strings. This isn't just a supply chain, Tony. It's an intelligence network. My people in Thailand know when the DEA is planning Hong Kong operations. My contacts in Hong Kong know when European customs is cracking down on French connections. Information flows both ways, and information is more valuable than heroin. Fat Tony stared at the map. You're not just a drug dealer, Frank. You're running your own CIA. Frank smiled. Better than the CIA. My people actually like working for me. By 1974, Frank possessed the most comprehensive organized crime intelligence network in the world. His files contained information about criminal operations on 6 continents. He knew which judges were corrupt in Naples, which customs officials were bribed in Marseilles, which generals were paid off in Bangkok. Frank Lucas had become the clearinghouse for international criminal intelligence. Every month, Frank would compile intelligence reports about Italian Mafia operations and send them to his contacts in Asia and Europe. Shipping schedules, money laundering techniques, corruption networks, law enforcement informants. Everything. Frank wasn't just selling heroin internationally. He was selling intelligence. And that intelligence was worth more than any drug shipment. But Frank understood something even deeper. He'd built his empire by being 3 moves ahead of everyone else. And in early 1975, Frank saw what was coming. The game was changing. Colombian cartels were moving into New York with cocaine money. Jamaican posses were bringing unprecedented violence. The old rules of organized crime were dissolving into chaos. Frank realized his advantages were disappearing. When everyone thinks globally, thinking globally is no longer an advantage. When everyone has international connections, connections become commodities. Frank needed to make his next move before his enemies figured out how to copy his strategy. That's when Frank made his most audacious decision yet. He was going to do something no major criminal had ever done voluntarily. He was going to partner with law enforcement before they could destroy him. But Frank's masterstroke wasn't the business arrangement. It was what he did next. In March 1975, Frank picked up his phone and called the FBI directly. Agent Devine? This is Frank Lucas. I think we should meet. The conversation that followed changed everything. Special Agent John Devine had been chasing Frank Lucas for 3 years without success. Now Frank was calling him directly. Frank Lucas? How did you get this number? Frank chuckled. Agent Devine, I've got numbers you've never even heard of. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I have information you need. The meeting took place at a diner in Queens. Frank arrived alone, as promised. Devine brought 3 backup agents, hidden throughout the restaurant. Frank ordered coffee and got straight to business. Agent Devine, you've been trying to understand how the Italian families get their heroin into America, right? You've been watching the docs, following the money, wiretapping the phones. But you're looking in the wrong places. Frank slid a manila envelope across the table. This contains shipping manifests, financial records, and communication transcripts for every major heroin shipment that's come into New York in the past 2 years. Devine opened the envelope, scanned the documents. His eyes widened. How did you get this? Frank sipped his coffee. I didn't get it, Agent Devine. I created it. Every shipment you're looking at came through my network. I know about it because I made it happen. The deal Frank proposed was unlike anything in FBI history. Frank would provide complete intelligence on international heroin trafficking, including detailed information about European suppliers, Asian producers, military corruption, and political protection networks. In exchange, the FBI would grant Frank immunity from prosecution. Devine was skeptical. Why would you do this, Frank? You're at the top of your game. You're making millions. Why risk it all to help us? Frank's expression grew serious. Because I've been to the top, Agent Devine. And the view from up there showed me something I didn't like. The game is changing. It's getting more violent, more chaotic. The Colombians are coming with cocaine money. The Jamaicans are bringing gun violence. The old rules don't work anymore. Frank paused, looked out the window. I built my empire by being smarter than everyone else, by thinking globally while they thought locally. But now everyone's thinking globally. My advantages are disappearing. And when advantages disappear, empires fall. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Within 2 weeks, Frank Lucas became the most valuable informant in bureau history. Frank offered the FBI complete intelligence on international heroin trafficking in exchange for immunity. His cooperation led to over 400 arrests across 12 countries and dismantled the French Connection. Frank Lucas had done something unprecedented. He'd built a global empire, dominated it completely, then voluntarily dismantled it while transforming himself into law enforcement's greatest asset. When he was released in 1981 after serving less than 5 years, Frank had successfully transitioned from criminal kingpin to government consultant. The phone calls Frank made that November night in 1973 had consequences that lasted decades. They established principles of international cooperation that law enforcement still uses today. They demonstrated how intelligence networks could be more powerful than military force. Most importantly, they proved that in the modern world, the smartest criminals weren't those who fought the system, but those who learned to work within it. Frank Lucas had rewritten the rules of power. And every mobster in America had to learn those new rules, or be crushed by them.